So tonight's lecturer, when I heard about him, I thought, this is one of these really, really, really irritating people who can do everything. And he's been just about everywhere, and he's made films in places that I would love to go to, and I know I never will, which is enough to make anybody grit their teeth. And not only that, but he's discovered about 40 new species, which, as a biologist, as I once was, is the thing that makes me really, really jealous. Ladies and gentlemen, Stewart McPherson.
Thank you very much. Is that on? Hello? Oh yes, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, fellow explorers, thank you so much for coming tonight. My objective tonight, and if I succeed tonight, you all, each and every one of you, will leave this lecture theatre with a totally different understanding of our great country. My lecture is on Britain's treasure islands, the UK overseas territories. This is an extraordinary side of the UK that very few people know exists. I think it is the most extraordinary side of our great country. And they're treasure islands not because of gold or silver, but because of the astounding wildlife, unique cultures, incredible landscapes, and amazing people that live on them. So this is a very quick overview of Britain's treasure islands. And I've just forgotten my remote. So thank you for coming. My name is Stewart McPherson. I imagine, I'll take the liberty of assuming that most of you come from the UK. I imagine that this is what most of you assume to be the United Kingdom. The British Isles, the cold, wet, rainy islands in Europe that the rest of the world makes fun of us for our terrible weather. Of course, we have a diverse and beautiful country, but this is what most people assume to be the United Kingdom. Well, I'm here to tell you tonight that 7 times that land area is scattered all across the globe in 14 groups of islands and archipelagos, scattered all across the 7 seas. There is no country on Earth with the same situation. No other country in the world has territories in all of the oceans of the world, covering pretty much every major habitat type, from rainforests to reefs to incredible deserts to polar ice and Antarctic wastelands. Some of the greatest wildlife spectacles on the planet. Who would have thought this is British wildlife with the largest populations of penguins on Earth? And yes, those are penguins. Just to flick backwards and forwards, those are penguins, and that is what the UK government is responsible for. From the most pristine coral reefs on the entire planet, to exploding volcanoes, one of the largest populations of breeding sea turtles in the Atlantic and one of the largest in the world, populations of flamingos, to cacti gardens, and this is just, if you excuse the pun, the tip of the iceberg. My story is quite simple. I just want to really quickly tell you who I am and why I've done this journey, this somewhat crazy journey to all the territories. I grew up, like many in my generation, absolutely in admiration and just absolutely fascinated by the wonderful documentaries of David Attenborough, one of the greatest storytellers of our generation. And he is actually my first memory, my earliest memory. And I grew up loving his work, and to me the Natural History Museum in London was almost like a religious building. In many respects it's actually very similar to a cathedral, and for naturalists across the world I think many people can relate. It almost has an almost religious significance. I had no choice. I always had to go into natural history. I had no choice whatsoever. That was the only, that's the why I'm on this planet. That's what I was here to do. So I had no choice but to go into the animals and plants that I love. But the problem is, to become a naturalist or to have a career in looking at wildlife in any way is very difficult. There's no exam to pass. It's not like a doctor's or to become a doctor or become a lawyer. There's no bar to pass or qualification to take. It's just a very strange, slow process of slowly building up and making contacts and trying to make a name and build those connections to slowly get opportunities and do this. So, as a teenager, I set out at the age of 16 to write a series of 25 books looking at plants. I love all plants and animals, but ever since I was a child, I loved carnivorous plants, that is, plants that capture and kill animals. I'm sure you all know the famous Venus flytrap on the left, but that's actually only one of about 700 species that occur all across the globe. And this was a very good subject to start, particularly as an inexperienced young person trying to set out in this field, because basically carnivorous plants are some of the most spectacular, some of the most intricate plants on the planet. They create leaves of incredible complexity that capture animals as big as rats. And the bizarre thing was that they were studied by tens, or grown by tens of thousands of people all around the globe. But yet, hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of them, had never even been photographed. We didn't even know how they grow in the wild, let alone the incredible forms and their ecology. Many of them had never been seen or even photographed since they were discovered, in some cases, hundreds of years ago. And despite the fact that they were grown by thousands of people around the world, for many of them, no one had ever looked at them in the wild. So this was a very easy, a project that I started because it's relatively easy. Unlike animals, plants don't move or run off, so they're relatively easy to photograph. If you imagine like a snow leopard, it takes famous cameramen 9 months to get that 3-second clip that you see in Planet Earth, and of course I didn't have the resources or the time to do that. So I set out to do a systematic series of books looking at each group of carnivorous plants in the wild and their habitat as a way of a first step in moving forward. While I was at university, I was very lucky to get a scholarship to go to Yale in America, and I used some of that scholarship to organize helicopter expeditions to the tepuis or tepuis, these massive sandstone plateaus that are encircled on all sides by sheer cliffs up to 1,000 meters tall. These are the lost worlds of Arthur Conan Doyle's very famous story, and in a very real sense they've been isolated for millions of years and harbour unique plants and animals that occur nowhere else on the planet, including plants and animals that have survived since the time of the dinosaurs, and some of the greatest levels of unique plants and animals on Earth. If you'd like to come back, it'd be a pleasure to give a talk about these, but this is a separate life and a separate time. But in many senses, they are like islands. They've got island ecology. They're basically fragments of a habitat isolated in a sea of another, totally different habitat. And their biogeography is very much like that. And they're often called islands in the sky or islands in time, and it's a very apt illustration. Anyway, they're very difficult to explore. Many of them have only actually very slightly been explored or never really surveyed properly for their animals and plants. And so my project started off doing a series of helicopter expeditions to about 30 of these plateaus, looking particularly for the carnivorous plants. I was very fortunate to discover a number of new pitcher plants and sundews along the way. Also some really weird plants like these iridescent, shiny Stegolepis hitchcockii plants, which I think had only ever been seen once before. And this is not a pigment, this is an iridescent shine like a CD. So these plants flash with their leaves an electric blue iridescence. And this is actually one of the ones that I was lucky to discover and name Drosera solaris. Anyway, so that was great. I wrote 2 books while I was at university, but then graduated 8 years ago and started to continue this. I took out a massive loan from a bank. I climbed like 300 mountains, including a load, I think about 30 that had not been climbed before, and tried to find all of these different intricate carnivorous plants, these extraordinary plants that capture and kill animals. And I was very fortunate to discover, I had no idea we were going to find them, but 2 of the biggest carnivorous plants that were ever discovered, including this one, which is named after David Attenborough. And this one is particularly interesting because we found in it trapped rodents. That's a shrew there. And we went back to this exact picture 2 months later and found the rodent had been digested to a husk, which you can see here. This is not normal. I don't really know why you're laughing, but anyway, okay. This poor little shrew, poor little shrew, I think, was obviously in search of water, but unfortunately met its end in a giant pitcher plant, which probably isn't the best of fates, but such was the case here. And this isn't normal. The plants have not evolved to capture and kill vertebrates. It's an exaggeration to say that, and the media often say that, but it's not actually true. They evolved to catch and kill insects, but under very rare circumstances, the biggest of these traps can also catch rodents, as is the case here. Anyway, that was all very great, but the problem was that, I was doing all these books, and that's lovely, and that wasn't what I wanted to do. I desperately wanted to get into documentaries, but they worked in the sense that I was able to do a few short pieces in a couple of films. I was on a BBC Two one with a couple of minute segment, and a wonderful one by Sky Vision, which actually David Attenborough presented, and I had the honour of presenting a few sections through it. But I would write and put my heart and soul into writing these treatments and proposals. I'd submit them to broadcasters and production channels, and always be exactly the same. There'd be a spike of interest, and then be going, yes, that's a wonderful idea. Then nothing would happen. 6 months would pass, nothing would happen, and then a year or 2 years later, I'd see my idea being made without me, and that happened like 20 times. So about 3 years, I thought, well, I've had enough of this. I've got to roll the dice and give it a go and see I've got to try. I've got to take a chance. So I used every penny from my books, every loan I could muster, every card I could max out, everything, and hired a professional ex-BBC crew. I bought broadcast quality camera equipment and set out on a 70,000 kilometre journey, which took eventually 3 years to complete. Which is this story that I'm about to relay to you. Just before I start, I just need to relay one thing that's very important. The territories are not colonies. Most people assume that the territories are colonies. They're not. A colony, by definition, is if you come in and stake a flag and say, that is mine. The territories, it's a modern relationship that is not what they are at all. Most of them democratically choose to remain under UK sovereignty. The other ones are uninhabited or military bases. So the territories are not colonies. They're often sensationalized to be colonies for getting headlines. That's not what they are. They're modern places with very, very, very important populations that are self-governing and democratically choose to remain part or under the sovereignty of the UK. Anyway, just to begin with, the challenges of visiting these territories are a little bit crazy. Some of them are the most remote inhabited islands in the world. Others are very strict military bases. To many of them, no tourists at all are allowed to go. And some of them are uninhabited with no regular means of transport. When I started this, it was pretty obvious that there was some unconventional travel involved, involving RAF military flights, the last working Royal Mail postal ship, freight ships, trawlers, charter yachts, and I had to somehow get 2 icebreakers together to go to 2 of them. So no one apparently, or no one has filmed on many of the territories. Apparently, I don't really know this, but apparently no one has ever been to all of them. Certainly no one's really explored them. Loads of people said I was stupid and naive. I wasn't naive. I knew totally the risks involved, and I also knew that it might not work, and it still might not work. But anyway, I made that decision anyway, and basically I left 3 years ago this month, so it's very appropriate that it's now. Anyway, tonight I'm going to give you, an 80-minute lecture now, and then questions at about 9 o'clock. And in a nutshell, these are very, very summarised stories. I'd love to lecture you once on each of the territories, but it's just not possible, for obvious reasons, unless you want to stay here all night. Just quickly, I forgot to say, the territories, okay, so there's actually 14 technically, but really there's 16, and that is because one of them consists of 3 groups of islands. So basically there's 3 in the Atlantic, Ascension, Helena and Tristan da Cunha. There are 2 in the Mediterranean, Gibraltar and the sovereign bases on Cyprus. There's 1 in the Indian Ocean, the British Indian Ocean Territory. There's 1 in the Pacific, which is Pitcairn, and there's 3 in the Southern Ocean, which is Falkland, South Georgia and the Antarctic Territory. And then there's 6 in the Caribbean, which consists of Bermuda, Cayman, Turks and Caicos, British Virgin Islands, Anguilla and Montserrat. So officially there's 14, really there's actually 16, but anyway. So the journey started at RAF Bryce Norton, RAF military base in Oxfordshire, and I had to board military flights. I was actually expecting them to be camo, big Hercules things, and they're not actually, they're just normal planes that are painted grey. But nevertheless, it was a very adventurous start, and we left with all these exotic locations, such as Afghanistan and Iraq on the departure boards, and headed to Ascension Island. And this is Ascension Island here. It is perhaps the most un-British landscape you could possibly imagine. It's a volcanic island of cinder cones and volcanic deserts. It's a spectacular island of different colours of ash. Each cinder cone is a slightly varying colour, and it's a very good example to start with, because it actually illustrates why the territories were settled and what their origins are. And in a nutshell, Ascension was settled because it's in the South Atlantic, and it was absolutely key for getting around the capes. In a day before refrigerators and modern technology in the 18th and 19th centuries, or in fact even earlier, these outposts were incredibly important for resupplying with water, food, and later coal. And honestly, without these outposts, it's very hard to get around the Cape. So they were very important for the exploration of the world, and for basically creating the world that we know today. Ascension has vast castle complexes, and in those there are vast banks of water bottles, and also bottles for citrus, which was key for obviously curing scurvy, or preventing scurvy rather. And it's an extraordinary island where it's got savage coasts littered with shipwrecks, and it was here where people with yellow fever, if a ship had yellow fever, it's here that the ship would pull in. They'd literally chuck off all of the people with yellow fever and just leave them to their fate, and the ones that would live, and the ones that would die. And of course, the overwhelming majority did. And there's graves of the crew of ships, for example, at Comfortless Cove here. So it's a very dramatic history. Connected to this story are the turtles. It is one of the largest sea turtle breeding sites in the world, particularly for green turtles, particularly in the Atlantic. And huge numbers came here. But in the early days, they were killed in vast numbers. Thousands were slaughtered. And the reason for that is because a turtle is a 200, 300 kilo chunk of meat that for ships going around the world that had salted beef or pork that is rancid and boring and tastes terrible with sea biscuits, of course, which would you rather have? A lovely fresh turtle, which by all accounts actually was very tasty, or a load of rancid meats that they'd had on board probably for months or even years. So obviously it was a no-brainer that the turtles were killed in their thousands, and actually stored in these vast ponds, because the turtles only come here to breed for a certain few months each year. So these vast ponds were constructed to keep hundreds of living turtles alive outside the breeding season. And ships would come in, they'd buy turtles, that winch in the background would haul them up onto the ships. And you can actually stack turtles upside down, and as long as you keep them wet, they'll survive for months and then be slaughtered when the sailors wanted. So, of course, it's a very cruel and very tragic process. And tragically, they were decimated. However, many of these territories, as you'll hear, have some of the earliest conservation laws, and very, very, very early conservation thinking, well ahead of their time. And the turtles have been protected for 100 years and have absolutely exploded back in numbers. And they're not just conserved, they're actively saved. For example, they go down onto the lava fields, and teams of conservationists and squaddies go and pick them up and take them back to the ocean and actually save them. So it's a really wonderful success story, and it shows that if we actually conserve things, they can bounce back spectacularly. Well, the ships also brought rats, cats, and mice, also in plague proportions, in huge, huge numbers. And that had the impact of absolutely wiping out the bird populations. This landscape that you can see in front, all of these white splotches are the baked guano of birds and bird nests that died out 100 or even 200 years ago. All of those are birds. There would have been millions and millions on the island, and now there's not one. It's silent. There's one species, sorry, that's not quite right. There is one species, but all of the other ones were wiped out, including lots of unique flightless species that occurred nowhere else in the world. And now it is eerily silent, and they're called ghost colonies. All the birds were wiped out on the mainland, but there's one little island offshore called Bosunbird Island, this little stack. It's not very big. However, for the birds that could fly, they retreated there, away from the cats, the rats, and the mice, which never got there. And this island is crammed full of bird life. It is literally caked in guano. That's why it's white as opposed to volcanic black. And you can see it is literally caked. It was actually once mined for phosphorus and guano for fertilizer. But anyway, it is crammed full of birds. And when you go up there, you can barely move for birds. But it's the home for this one, which is very special. This is the Ascension frigatebird, and this species was endemic, or is endemic, to Ascension Island, and occurs now only on this one tiny stack, which is a few times bigger than this room. So this is the only place where it survived. While we were filming, the RSPB had put in dummy model frigatebirds back on the mainland. They'd wiped out all the feral cats and controlled the rats and the rodents in great numbers. And while we were filming, we had this beautiful moment whereby the very first Ascension Island frigatebird returned back to the mainland in 185 years. And this is the very first chick that has been reared on the mainland since the times of Charles Darwin. So again, it just goes to show that extinction can, or conservation can be reversed. It's not just doom and gloom. It is absolutely, if we care and act, we can change things. And that's one of the great lessons from the territories. Anyway, Charles Darwin visited on the Beagle in 1836, and he reached, of course, this dry, barren, volcanic island. And he undertook an incredible experiment. And in brief, I just want to relay this to you. As I mentioned earlier, this is what the island looks like originally. It is an ash volcanic peak, a cinder cone. It is baked. Someone had a lovely quote that said, it's hell with the fires put out. And it's very, very, very apt. It is literally, as you walk through, clouds and clouds of ash follow wherever you walk because it's so dry and so arid. Darwin, and later who later became his best friend, Joseph Hooker, who visited on the Erebus and the Terror in 1842, I believe, they were given the task by the Royal Navy of improving the island. And what that meant is to try and create water for the soldiers that were garrisoned there to prevent Napoleon Bonaparte from escaping on the nearby island of St. Helena. Now you might ask, how on earth do you create water? How do you create rain? How do you? Well, the answer, which Darwin and Hooker devised, is an extraordinarily inventive one. What they did, they sent tens of thousands of plants, trees and shrubs and planted them on the tallest part of the tallest peak in the middle of the island. Over 30 years, the plants came on pretty much all the ships heading south towards Ascension Island. They carried pots of lilies, pots of palms, pots of shrubs, pots of ficus, all sorts of plants and plants. And they were planted on this mountain, which today is called Green Mountain, which you can probably gather why. The experiment not just succeeded, but succeeded so extraordinarily well. As you climb up it today, you go through natural-looking layers that resemble the layers of tropical mountains. In the lowlands, you go through eucalyptus forest, which is, of course, from Australia, and cacti from the Americas. Then, a little higher, you go through real lowland rainforest with palms, bananas, epiphytes, platycerium ferns, you name it, like a real rainforest. Then, higher still, you get to montane cloud forest, mountaintop vegetation, which consists of giant bamboos, often like on Southeast Asian mountains, and real cloud forest, mossy, montane, stunted trees, really highly divided branches. It's just an incredible experiment. This is totally man-made. There is nothing like this on Earth. There are no ecosystems that are comparable, that are man-made, of plants and animals that are flung from different corners of the world that have just adjusted like this. And it's even been used as a case to send algae to Mars to terraform an atmosphere. I don't think that will ever happen, but NASA studied it for that reason. Anyway, Ascension also shows very nicely why these territories are so special. This is, I think, in my opinion, one of the loveliest stories, and the stories that is closest to my heart. This little pond here, it's brackish, so it's influenced by the sea, but it is not salt water, but it is also not fresh water. It's a mixture. In these little ponds, you find these strange balls of algae, and these little shrimp, these little white little fellas up here. These shrimps tell an extraordinary story. The story is this. The island is only 1 million years old. It's a volcano. It came up through the sea, and in the last million years, these shrimps have arrived. Their closest relatives are in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. They were transported, we don't really know, possibly by hurricanes or possibly on the feet of birds. And they travelled across the equator and landed exactly in this tiny pond. Exactly that. And just think about it. You cannot comprehend how infinitesimally unlikely this is. This is a speck of land in an insanely big ocean. If they'd have landed in the ocean, the eggs would have died. If they landed on the baked lava fields, they'd also have been desiccated and died. They didn't. They landed precisely in these tiny, perfect habitats, these ponds, and have since diversified, and have diversified into multiple species. Islands are engines of evolution. They change and twist animals and plants in unusual and often unpredictable ways because of their isolation. Normal processes are suspended because of their often the simplicity of the ecosystems. And in these pools, we can see the primordial soup bubbling and boiling, and evolution literally taking place before us. There are endemic species of shrimps in each individual ponds. In some cases, they're that localized. I think even though they're not a big, spectacular animal, what it represents, I think, is extraordinary. And we know that this couldn't be a relic of a time of South America and Africa being connected, or the Americas being connected to the old world, because this island is so young. It could only have reached there through some kind of vector, some transport vector. So, because of these islands, because of their power to create and twist animals and speciate animals, they harbour unique plants and animals that occur nowhere else on the planet. And one of those on Ascension are these land crabs that occasionally make these vast migrations down to the ocean and release their eggs into the water. They incidentally would drown in the water. They can't survive in water. They're not normal crabs. They live on the land. So this power of these islands is very strange. Unfortunately, there's hundreds more stories I'd love to tell you on Ascension, but sadly we just don't have time. So the next territory beckons, which is St. Helena, and the last working Royal Mail postal ship, the RMS St. Helena, called in and is the link to the next island. She represents 400 years of Royal Mail postal ship history. The Titanic was an RMS, a Royal Mail ship, the RMS Titanic, and she is this wonderful relic from this glorious age of travel by sea. Oops, sorry. 3 days or so later, steaming across the South Atlantic, and finally we reach this beautiful island, St. Helena, often called the Emerald of the South Atlantic. We came ashore, and it's very extraordinary. It's this fragment of Britain flung down into the South Atlantic with incredible architecture, and also in a positive way by virtue of its isolation. There's no crappy concrete blocks, there's no 70s architecture. It's lovely. You can stroll around the streets that have unchanged for hundreds of years and see this wonderful, glorious architecture still in place. And I'm sure you will recognize the similarity to churches and buildings in the towns and villages from whence you've come. St. Helena has its own currency. There's approximately 3,000 saints on the island, and they have their own currency, the St. Helena pound, which I thought was amazing, considering that there's only 3,000 people, approximately. They have their own currency. It's actually tied to the pound, so it's actually 1-to-1 parity to the British pound, but nevertheless, they have these lovely, wonderful, old-school papery notes, which I loved. Anyway, St. Helena is a beautiful green island. It's verdant, it's luxurious, it's very different from Ascension, but not all as well. Only 1% of the plants that you see are native, 1%. It was a much older island. I believe it was about 7 million years, as opposed to Ascension being only 1. It had a much richer ecosystem with hundreds, not just a few dozens, but hundreds of unique plants and animals. And unfortunately, it was being impacted for a far greater period. So it's a greater ecosystem that's fallen further. And what we see today is a broken shell of that ecosystem, just the fragments of a unique lost world. It was particularly special for arthropods, bugs. was home to this massive giant earwig, a legendary animal. I think they could be 6 or 7 centimetres long. The biggest earwig in the world, if there's any earwig enthusiasts in the room. And also, for any woodlice enthusiasts, the wonderful spiky yellow woodlouse. This looks like a caterpillar. It's not. It's a woodlouse, as in what you turn over a log here in the UK and see. But here they live on trees and I believe consume the vegetation, but are bright yellow and covered in spikes. So anyway, and lots of unique plants and animals and several birds that occur nowhere else in the world. However, flax, New Zealand flax, was introduced basically for the ship rope industry, for building twine and ropes. And if you remember the old parcel twine, probably I would bet money that many of you have used twine many decades ago from St. Helena. In the 60s, artificial nylon was introduced, and the industry completely and utterly collapsed. Why basically use twine when you've got nylon? It's infinitely cheaper and stronger. Why? So as a consequence, the old flax mills closed, the industry was bankrupted, and it changed. However, the flax plants became rampant. And these are flax here, and as you can see, they literally carpet the entire landscape. They moved out all of the endemic plants and most of the endemic animals, and those now survive in the marginal habitats. For example, the cliff sides, where the flax hasn't yet colonized or can't colonize. It was too late for some. A few did unfortunately slip off the cliff of extinction. This plant unfortunately has a very unfortunate name. It's called the bastard gumwood tree. That really is its real name. And there's only 2 bastard gumwood trees in the world, mature specimens like this. So the conservationists swooped in just in time and saved those unique species, including, fortunately, for the bastard gumwood tree, this species. They captured the last of the kind of those plants, and in many cases there was literally 1 specimen left of some species, or 2 or 3, the last of their kind, intensively bred them, created specialist conservation gardens, and bred them up in huge numbers. And today they're replanting them, not just to create the plants, but to rebuild the entire ecosystem that is totally key to saving the animals as well. And there's one really lovely point I just want to make here. This is the Millennium Forest. They're planting thousands of the different trees, endemic trees, native trees of St. Helena. Now the trees take hundreds of years to mature, and the conservationists, they're so inspiring because they know very clearly that there is no way that they will see this forest and this project mature in their lifetime. But yet they're doing it anyway. They're nevertheless pushing forward. They're nevertheless replanting these. And I think that is so inspiring that even though they will never see the result, they are still doing it, and they're rebuilding this ancient ecosystem and saving these different plants and animals. Anyway, on a slightly lighter note, as you might know, St. Helena is a very famous location for Napoleon Bonaparte. After the Battle of Waterloo, he actually surrendered after he was finally defeated. He surrendered and assumed that Wellington would put him to some luxurious palace or luxurious beautiful home in the south of England, because there was a great comradeship and respect between the 2 great generals. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. It kind of backfired a little bit. Napoleon, as I'm sure you know, had already escaped at that point from Elba, already raised a massive army, and in the ensuing wars, millions of people had died. Depending upon whose side you are, he was either a monster or a hero. But anyway, the British captured him, or he surrendered rather to the British and was captured, and assumed that he was going to go and live out the rest of his days in luxury. But it wasn't to be. Someone said to him, they said, "You will become the modern Prometheus. You will be shackled to a rock where the memory of your own greatness will gnaw at you." And that basically obviously means, for a man that tried to conquer and rule the world, the cruelest, harshest fate would be to send him to a far-flung island where he'd be king of only that island, this tiny, tiny outpost, and where the memory of his own greatness, of what could have been, and in fact what was for many years, will gnaw at him. So Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life on St. Helena, actually in this house, Longwood, and it's actually a French enclave within a British territory. He was this tragic, broken destroyed hero, a tragic hero that spent out the rest of his days. The British actually did not want him to escape again. They had 4 ships continually circling the island. They had thousands of troops on the island. They also garrisoned Tristan da Cunha and Ascension, that you heard earlier. They really did not want this guy to escape. And every time a ship called into St. Helena, it was only allowed to leave if the governor had expressed confirmation that he was basically locked in Longwood House. So there was no way he was going to escape. There were plans hatched that someone would rescue him and take him to Latin America, and he would raise a grand army and resume the massive war and try and conquer Europe again. But that, of course, never happened. He eventually died in lonely isolation. And this is inside his home, and this is the very bed where he died, and the death mask from his corpse, which are there. Anyway, I'd love to tell you more about St. Helena, but I can't. So the next territory is Tristan da Cunha, the most remote inhabited island on the planet. This is a very, very, very special territory, and really the only way you can really normally get there is the RMS goes down to Cape Town, and from Cape Town there are trawlers that call in a few times a year, 4 or 5 or 6 times a year, and it is with those vessels that you normally go. However, when I went there, unfortunately the trawler was in dry docks, so I was definitely not going with her. I contacted about 20 yacht companies, private charter yacht companies, and only one was perhaps foolish enough to accept me, and I chartered her, and the idea was to go to Tristan da Cunha. There were loads of salty old sea dogs in the False Bay Yacht Club from whence we left, and they didn't speak like this, obviously, but you get the idea. They're sort of, well, or it'll take 3 weeks to get there, or whatever. And many of them had no idea. Some of them said months. Some of them said you would never get there because we're going against the currents, against the winds. Some of them said it would take 8 weeks. Some of them said it would take... None of them had actually done it, of course. None of them had actually been there. And none of them really had any factual basis to go on. Because some people do go to Tristan from Rio, which is much easier because you've got the wind and the currents with you. But it's much harder from this direction. But anyway, we thought we'd just try it anyway and go for it. So myself, a cameraman, a skipper, and 1 crew got on board the Supreme Lady yacht and headed out. However, I had imagination of the South Atlantic being roaring wind and rolling oceans and really, really rough conditions, but that was not to be. We left, had a couple of days of good wind, and then hit the doldrums, and we were stuck with glass water, no wind, nothing, not a breath of air. And obviously in a sailing boat, that poses a bit of a problem, especially on account of the fact that we only had a few days of diesel. And we actually saw this tanker on the horizon, this massive tanker passed us. And the skipper said, look, don't worry, I've been in this situation before. I'll just hail the tanker, and what they've done before is just chuck a big drum of diesel over the side, because it was a diesel vessel, and we'll just wire them some funds. Well, they probably won't even care. So don't worry, we'll just hail this tanker. So that's precisely what we did. We're, massive tanker on horizon. This is a small motor yacht, a small yacht with the white sail, stuck in the doldrums, over. And the first thing was, they said, well, why are you out here? This is way off the shipping lanes. There's nothing out here. We're like, yeah, we know. However, please, would you be so kind as to chuck a drum of diesel over the back of your massive trawler? We will totally wire you 10 times the money if you want it, whatever. We will definitely do that. But could you please just help us out and chuck a drum over? The person that we're speaking to said, yeah, absolutely no problem. We do this all the time. We'll go and just clear it with the captain and come back to you. So we're obviously anxiously waiting, but rubbing our hands somewhat in glee, thinking, yes, we're going to have the fuel to continue our journey. However, the captain came back on and said, unfortunately, we've got 70 million gallons of petrol, but not a drop of diesel. It's very unfortunately, very tragically, and it really made me think of Samuel Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which was, day after day, we stuck, nor breath, nor motion. as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. And such was the case, of course, with our diesel. And of course, water is the great challenge out here. You know, food we'd got enough of, or could certainly survive. The water, by the way, there's no fish. This is a barren. This is equivalent of a desert in this area. We didn't catch a single fish. But water is the big problem, and we were actually genuinely getting a bit short. We could all only have showers like once every 3 days, which wasn't the best. And even worse, we were taunted by albatrosses. As I'm sure many of you know, the ancient mariner shot an albatross. They went south in the story. They went south towards the land of ice, Antarctica, but were led north again by an albatross that guided their way. When they got back into the warmer waters and warmer conditions, the ancient mariner shot the albatross with a crossbow. And they then got stuck in the doldrums like we had, ran out of water, and were desperate. They suffered and were desperately suffering from lack of water. Well, of course, we didn't shoot any albatrosses. The ancient mariner had to then actually have one around his neck as a symbol of shame and guilt. Of course, we didn't shoot any albatrosses, but nevertheless, endemic species of albatrosses circled our vessel. And these species were endemic only to Tristan da Cunha, or the Tristan group. And so they were taunting us because they could fly there and glide effortlessly over the water and be there probably in hours or certainly a day or two, whereas we were stuck with all our technology hopelessly in a boat with no power, no wind, alone, empty, thousands of kilometers from anyone, and we're stuck. Anyway, eventually the winds did break, of course, as they always do, and 3 weeks later we finally reached Tristan, but it was a misty day. And we saw on this old green radar, this old World War II style beep, beep kind of radar, that there's this massive island ahead of us, and we got within a kilometre of it, but could not see it at all. It was misty, a white wall. But then suddenly, out of that mist, suddenly a grey, then black wall of the volcano suddenly emerged, and we'd arrived. And it was amazing to see how massive it is. And this is a shot of Tristan, obviously, from the air. It's a spectacular volcano that rises out of the South Atlantic. It is the most remote inhabited island in the world. 270 people call Tristan home. This lecture theatre holds 300, so just have a look around you. It's roughly the same level. And if this were Tristan here, if we were here on Tristan now, the nearest human settlement in any direction would be past Moscow away. Just really think about that now for a second. A 4-hour flight away. It boggles the mind. And what that journey really conveyed to me was how unbelievably vast these oceans are. On a map, it just looks like a few centimetres, or in a jumbo jet, it's a couple of hours flying time. But when you're down on the ground and you actually get a concept of how impossibly massive the oceans are and how impossibly remote this place really is. Anyway, so this is Tristan da Cunha. This is Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, the only settlement. The settlement plain, the only bit that's really habitable on the island is down here, a tiny little area. And this is the settlement, home to 270 people. And it is, say, the most remote inhabited island in the world. And it has one supermarket. And I thought this was so charming. There are 2 kilometres, or roughly 2 kilometres of road, and a little bus that takes you along there, which I thought was such a charming little thing. And the Tristanians, they're the only territory to be they could be totally self-sufficient. They do import things from the outside world, but they don't need to. You could cut them off. If the rest of the world ceased to exist, they'd survive quite happily, thank you very much. They grow crops, they grow potatoes, lots of vegetables, they have sheep, cows, cattle. They're incredibly resourceful and resilient. And this is only 2 kilometres away from the main settlement, but they have wonderful little holiday homes and go on holiday here. And it was just the most beautiful, most extraordinary, it was a life-changing experience going there. They are incredibly hardworking, wonderful people. And even though they are self-sufficient, they nevertheless, their greatest resource, which they sell for money, is lobsters. And because this is a very young island, There's relatively few species underwater, so each species fills a big niche, and also because of the very rich upwelling nutrients and waters, there are huge numbers of lobsters, huge numbers of lobsters. The Trustanians eat lobster very frequently, much more than us, like bread, like we eat bread or something like that, and they're very, very skillful lobster fishermen. They capture these lobsters in huge numbers and export them right the way around the world, and this is the majority of the revenue that they make. As you may know the famous Tristan story, whereby the volcano erupted in 1961, and the Trustanians left the island, and the volcano erupted just literally hundreds of meters from the houses. I believe one house was burnt, but had it been a few 100 meters in the direction of the settlement, it would have been wiped out. But they left Tristan, came to mainland UK, lived here for a few years, then chose to go back. And it was very telling. They missed their island. And something that I really thought about a lot was that Tristan used to be called the loneliest island in the world. Loneliest in the context of remotest. The loneliest inhabited island in the world. And while I was there, I got thinking, every single person, if you're from Tristan, every single person that you see every day is a friend or a family. There's 7 last names on the island, and every single person you know or are friends with. And yet, look at us. You know, you walk down London, you could walk for a day, a week, a month, and chances are you won't see a single soul that you know. So you have to ask yourself, who really is the loneliest ones, us or they? And I humbly submit that actually, on the contrary, they're not the lonely ones. We actually are in our isolated modern lives. They also have modern lives. I wasn't meaning to imply that, but yet they're the ones that have that wonderful family and friend structure intact, whereas we've completely lost that. So I thought that the word lonely in that context was quite interesting. Anyway, Tristan has this incredible lost world of unique tree ferns and endemic albatrosses and many other endemic species. And sorry, this is a bit low resolution, it's a screenshot from the video that we shot, but there's a really lovely story about how islands twist and change animals in strange and often unpredictable ways. And such is the case here. A songbird, the Tristan thrush, has been twisted by the island, but by island evolution rather, to drink the blood of penguins. This is the behind of a penguin, and the thrushes peck wounds and lick and drink the blood of the penguins just to fill an evolutionary niche that nothing else was exploiting on the island, on these islands. So it's a very interesting story. And the Tristan group actually consists of 4 islands: Tristan da Cunha, Inaccessible, Nightingale, and 200 miles further south, Gough Island. And Gough Island is very, very interesting because it, of course, was visited by mariners as well, but unlike Ascension, only mice were introduced. Not cats and not rats, just mice. And the consequence of that was that within 100 years, the mice have evolved. You have to be very careful using the word evolve, and most people use it incorrectly, but in this context, it is actually the right word. The mice have massively increased in size over the few hundred generations in the last century. They're now up to 27 centimeters long, and they eat the albatross chicks alive. They're monster mice, and they're a very big problem in threatening many of the species of albatross and seabirds on Gough Island. So in this case, they have become giant monster mice, and evolve is actually the right word to use here. Anyway, my last experience on one of the last days on Tristan was I was very kindly invited to be a judge at Queen's Day, for which I was coincidentally at the island for, and it was a wonderful English fete, like the English fetes that I grew up with, but 8,000, 9,000 miles from England, on the other side of the world in the South Atlantic. And I judged the onions, the potatoes, well, just like a fete here, the tomatoes, the cabbages, and had a very memorable tug of war, and also had to try 10 different chocolate cakes. And well, you might actually say that, well, what are you complaining about? That sounds great, that sounds delicious, but actually I can assure you, trying 10 different cakes is not as easy as it seems. And they were all delicious. However, I think I accidentally offended one of the Tristanian ladies. After 10 cakes, I have to admit I had my full of full of cakes. And under my breath I muttered something like, "Oh, that was lovely, but a bit dry. I'm not sure about that one. That was nice, but, you know." And I was obviously being eavesdropped because an elderly lady stormed out of a cupboard and muttering ran off, somewhat irate and angry. So I didn't mean to, but I think unfortunately I offended her. But nevertheless, they all were very good cakes and very nice. So that was my wonderful time on Tristan. I did visit the other islands, but just there's no time to convey that tonight. The next territory is Falklands, down in the South Atlantic, which Southern Ocean rather, which actually was one of the ones that I was most excited. I can't explain why I wanted to go here ever since I was a child. I don't know why, I just always did. And it's very striking because this is the Falkland Islands, but yet this could equally be in Britain, it could be in London, it could be in Bristol. This is one of the rows of houses in Stanley. There's lovely pubs, and most people think of the Falkland Islands just as full of sheep and wet and cold and rainy. But that is totally and utterly wrong. That is really wrong. They have beautiful white beaches. It's actually technically a semi-arid environment, which is the reason why there are no native trees. It's not because of the cold. It's not actually that cold. The temperature is, I think, comparable to Britain, or possibly even warmer than Britain. And it's certainly nowhere near as rainy. But yet people assume that it's a cold, wet island like in Scotland, but it's not. And it's home to some incredible animal stories and plant stories. Charles Darwin actually spent twice as long here as he did in the Galapagos. And before reaching Galapagos, he actually developed his rudimentary ideas of evolution on this animal, the wara, the Falkland wolf. But sadly, this beautiful animal was soon wiped out and now is totally extinct. Darwin also had trouble with these birds, the striated caracaras, the most mischievous and cunning birds you will ever meet in your entire life, I guarantee you. They're scavengers, so anything you put down, they will definitely steal. No, really, they're kleptomaniacs. They will steal anything, especially shiny things. And in the documentary, there's a lovely sequence. I just put down this bag, and they completely raided it and stole my notes. And as I was chasing after one with my notes, another one took out my wallet and nicked 10 quid. No, it really did. And so they're the most extraordinary. Anyway, Darwin got mugged by them. Him and his companion got their hat stolen, their compass, their wallet, all sorts of things. And they stole all these possessions and flew off with them. Anyway, this is actually what much of the Falklands originally would have looked like, full of big tussock grass. But most of it's been burnt or eaten by cattle or sheep. But yet this tussock, on the few islands where it occurs, it explodes into life when darkness falls, and it literally turns the sky dark with the number of shearwaters and birds that fly out of it. It's also home to spectacular populations of black-browed albatrosses and incredible colonies of penguins that go on and on and on. So it is very different to how most people imagine it. Of course, most people's image is unfortunately just of the Falklands War, which is a great tragedy. There are, of course, still the ruins of helicopters and planes and the graves of hundreds of British soldiers and servicemen, Argentinian servicemen, and 3 Falkland Islanders that sadly died. And it is, of course, a great tragedy, as well as 26,000 landmines that still litter the islands, 100 metres or so from Stanley, the capital. Most people assume landmines to be something in a far-off country affecting a far-off people, but that is not the case. Who would have thought that, British subjects, British citizens rather, are unfortunately afflicted by landmines. Imagine your children playing 100 metres from mines that would be lethal. And we actually followed a demining team and heard their stories. And there's this extraordinary area where they're demining, and the deminers told me that if you try and run from here to that bush over there, you will definitely blow up. There's no way you can get there there's so many mines, you will definitely die, or at least be blown up. And the terrible thing, of course, is that mines were not designed to kill, they were designed deliberately to maim. With a very significant difference, because if you maim a soldier, you not just take him out of action, but you then tie up the resources of your enemy to rescue him or look after him. So they're a very, very, very terrible evil. And unfortunately, as I say, there's something like 26,000 across the Falklands, and this is what they look like. They're plastic, you cannot detect them, they will survive for decades. These ones are 30 years old and they work like they're brand new. So unfortunately, there are these great fields of these beautiful orange flowers, and in many respects I thought they were like the poppies of France. They grow across the Falklands, and I thought some of the shots were in some respects somewhat similar to the poppies of France. Anyway, while I was there, and this was a coincidence, this honestly was not a Top Gear coincidence, this really was a coincidence, and it really truly was. I was in the Falklands for the referendum. My project is not political, I'm not going into politics, I'm squarely on the wildlife, I'm not into politics and all that, but nevertheless it was a very interesting moment in Falklands history, so of course we filmed it. The Falkland Islands had a referendum 2 years ago, as you may be aware of. They voted, well, you can probably guess what the result was going to be. It was 99.8% in favour of remaining a UK overseas territory. The question was not, do you want to be British or not, it's do you want to remain a UK overseas territory or not? And the answer, if they say no, it could be to join Argentina or any other country or become a sovereign entity in their own right. Sorry, they are already a sovereign entity in their right, I mean an independent country in their own right. But they chose to remain part of the UK, or under UK sovereignty, and that is their democratic choice. And they're a very proud people. If you ask them, they're likely to respond that they're Falkland Islander first, and then British. They have 8 generations of history. They predate many countries in South America. They're very, very proud, and they've got a wonderful culture and a wonderful identity. And it was a real honour to see that extraordinary moment in their history. Anyway, to get from the Falklands to the next territories was a challenge, because there's only 2 ways really you can go to South Georgia and the Antarctic territory, the next territories to go to. There are no people living on them. I could have gone on a commercial boat whereby you pay as a tourist to go on, but of course for filming, forget it, we'd get nothing, it would be a complete waste of time. So I actually managed to persuade 16 friends, one of which is here tonight, and persuaded 16 friends with myself and a cameraman, so 18 in total, to split the costs of 2 basically icebreakers. They're steel-hulled vessels built for cutting through ice, and by splitting the costs we managed to pay for them. They're like 120 grand or something, which of course I could never have afforded on my own. So by splitting it that way, we managed to get this trip on these 2 beautiful vessels, the Hans Hansen and the Golden Fleece, to go in a triangle to South Georgia, the Antarctic territory, then back. And the first impression I got jumping on board and meeting the captain was Captain Jerome had strung up a reindeer for which it had been introduced to some of the Falkland Islands. He'd shot one and was cutting it up and hacking it to pieces, because where we're going now there are no shops, there are no supplies, there is even in fact no hope of rescue. There's nothing out there, there is no one. And we actually had to sign a waiver stating clearly that we understood that. There's no one that can get to you quickly, or even really at all. So that was the next phase in the journey. We for 3 or 4 or 5 days, we headed out across the rough Southern Ocean, and now it really was rough. Very, very, very rough. But finally, we reached the glorious island of South Georgia. And as many of you I'm sure know, it's incredibly important for Antarctic and subpolar wildlife. It's the breeding hotspot. It's the only island really in the south which is free of ice year round. So it's a magnet for breeding. Loads of animals come here to breed. And we stepped ashore, and literally the first thing that I saw, the very first thing was showing how we have these concepts of nature and how wrong they are. The first thing I saw was how debased and how violent and how wild and how natural and pristine, but particularly how wild and violent real nature is. I was walking along literally after a minute or so of being on the island, and this giant petrel spotted this penguin. There were loads of penguins, but he targeted that one. And as this penguin was waddling down, he came behind it and literally nipped underneath its tail and literally cut it open and ripped its guts out as it was walking, and literally pulled it to pieces and disemboweled it as it was walking. We filmed all this, but it's horrific to watch, of course. And obviously isn't in the documentary, because I think more than one small child would probably start crying. And understandably, it's incredibly, but it showed how violent and how wild this island is. The petrels and the birds, this is a seal skeleton, and they actually pull the skin inside out. This is the skin here, like a wetsuit over the skull. They pull it inside out to get at the flesh, and there are skulls and bones. It's a wild place. But yet, despite that wildness, there's beauty. The wandering albatross, this incredible bird with a 3-meter wingspan, the biggest wingspan of all birds alive today. We watch them doing their beautiful rituals, and these things can be over the ocean for years at a time before returning and touching foot on land. And of course, the biggest penguin colonies on Earth. This is a population of over 500,000 birds. It is just, I cannot possibly relate to you how many there are. You cannot get it from photos. How noisy it is, how smelly it is as well, and just how vast it is. And the penguins and the seals all live together on the beaches for breeding during the breeding season. And of course the battling elephant seals as well that come up. And the elephant seals introduced now a slightly darker theme. Whalers from North America, from Europe, went down to South Georgia and other Antarctic and subantarctic islands to hunt what's called elephanting, hunting the elephant seals. And they hunted them for the blubber, which they'd flense and then process and sell, and also other products as well. But these things were virtually wiped out, then the fur seals, and then the great whales. And I tell the story of the great whales, although equally it relates also to the seals as well. But anyway, about just over 100 years ago, the whalers came in earnest and built 7 whaling stations. This is one of the smallest. Other ones are vast. Up to 3,000 people lived on this island at the height of the whaling station era at times. And 95% of the oil at that time, this is a time before real petrochemical industry existed, came from these whales. For lighting the street lamps in London, to creating the nitroglycerin in World War II bombs, and ironically also even the nitroglycerin in the harpoons that shot the whales, to all manner of different products. The use of the whale was almost endless. But the whales were absolutely decimated, nailed completely. The whaling stopped, and it was cheaper for the whalers just to literally down tools and leave everything where it was, not touch anything and just walk away from it. And that's precisely what happened. As a consequence, there are whaling ships still here with cannons loaded. There are blubber cookers and whale tanks that still drip whale oil. We filmed it dripping. There are the harpoons littered all around. There's thousands of the explosive harpoon heads. And there are a couple of very haunting messages from all this. And one of the haunting messages is that conservation totally failed. Totally and utterly failed here. The whaling stopped not because of the global moratorium on whaling, which I'm sure you know of. That was many years after the stations closed. The stations closed not because of the conservationists or the moratorium. They closed because there were so few whales left that the whaling was unprofitable. Therefore, the whalers it wasn't worth their while doing it. The whale populations reduced to 1 or 2% of their original numbers. And this animal, the blue whale, is the most haunting of all. This is the biggest animal that ever existed. It's called Balanoptera musculus, the biggest animal on the planet. Bigger than all the dinosaurs ever were. It's the biggest living thing that we know of that has survived or lived on our planet. It was reduced by some estimates to 1% of the original population that occurred. 1%. And the harsh, haunting fact is this. The stations closed mainly, I think, in 1967. And the fact is this, that if those stations had continued for 1 year more and operated at those levels whaling, there would simply have been too few blue whales surviving for blue whales to chance encounter. And as a consequence, reproduction would have been impossible. And the greatest animal that ever would have existed would have slipped into extinction. We came that close, a hair's breadth away from it, insanely close. Anyway, just so you can get this is not a blue whale skeleton, this is a relatively small whale, but just so you can get a concept of how massive these animals are. If you feel your jawbone, your mandible, I'm sitting on the whale's one here. Those at the back are the vertebrae. If you feel in your back those little pointy vertebrae, those are the whale's vertebrae. They're like this big. They are enormous. And as you may know, I'm not by the way, I'm not trying to preach, I'm not an eco-warrior, but it raises an interesting question. What have we honestly learned? Whaling is continuing today, and for some whales that's fine. It doesn't matter if it's non-endangered species, many people would argue. But there's serious efforts to resume commercial whaling of endangered species, such as humpbacks. And the recent efforts to make the Southern Ocean a whale moratorium area were shot down in flames. So it really makes you wonder, what have we actually learned? Anyway, on a slightly lighter note, we headed south following Ernest Shackleton's Trans-Antarctic expedition, exactly 100 years in his footsteps. And our ships were heading down south towards the Weddell Sea, which he went. As we approached Antarctica, and Antarctica is extraordinary because you can feel it. You can feel it over the horizon before you can ever see it. It doesn't make any sense physically. Cold things don't radiate cold, but whatever. You can definitely feel this cold mass. You can feel the enormity of it. Somehow you know it's coming over the horizon. And as we got close, we crossed enormous icebergs. And just remember, 9/10 of the iceberg is below water. And this is a tiny berg. There are icebergs bigger than Britain that break off. Really, bigger than Britain. So just comprehend how massive those bergs are and how tiny our reasonable sized ship is in comparison, and that 9/10 of it is underwater. So we sailed between the icebergs and were greeted with a very lovely, I thought this was a lovely way to arrive. Whales can live up to at least 60, 70 years. The truth is we don't really actually know, but probably they're even older than that. So whales totally could be alive today that lived through the whaling era. Yet we were greeted by hundreds of humpbacks, which almost like a Disney movie were just frolicking and breaching right next to our boat and spraying us with their stinky breath and playing around. And I thought it was so humbling to think in a very innocent way just how the whales still greet us today after we've nailed and decimated and destroyed them, and yet they're still frolicking and playing, and you can see how easy they were to shoot and kill. Anyway, we got down and saw the grace and the beauty and the majesty of Antarctica, and saw these incredible ice flows. And of course, as you may know, there's only 2 species of flowering plants in Antarctica, and other mosses and lichens as well. But it's so slow growing. A footprint can last 10 years, 20 years maybe. This is of course not one of mine, I should add, but nevertheless you can see how insanely fragile it is. We went to some of the research bases, and one of them, Port Lockroy, it was a British base that was left, I think, 20, 30 years ago. And everything is sort of frozen in time, literally frozen in time, with old Marmite and old tins, which I'm sure many of us will recognise. And of course some very patriotic penguins that trumpet under the Union flag. The last thing I want to show you in Antarctica, we wanted to film and see some of these incredible leopard seals. And these are huge. You think of seals like 1 metre or 2 long. These are not. These are huge. 3 metres definitely, maybe even 4. I think possibly up to 4. Anyway, like bigger than this bench huge. We went out to try and film them in a little Zodiac to see them. They're very cruel. They play with their prey. They'll catch a penguin, then let it go, and then swim after it, catch it, let it go, then rip off one of its wings, and then basically torture it and eat it. And we didn't use this in the documentary, but it is part of nature down there, and we went to see it. So we watched and filmed that and photographed that. Then the seal turned its attention to us and started peeking over the Zodiac looking at us. And I can assure you that is a pretty scary thing, because this thing could easily flip over the Zodiac. So we got on board pretty quickly, and by this point our half of a reindeer was diminishing rapidly, so it was about time we left Antarctica and headed to warmer climes. So that is only a fraction of the stories really from Antarctica, but anyway. The next territory is the British Indian Ocean Territory, and this in many ways is the jewel in the crown for this project. This place is incredibly special. It's an archipelago of 60 islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's the last system of tropical islands literally on the planet that is completely pristine. There's about 60 islands. One is people on it, is inhabited, well, rather there's people on it. It's called Diego Garcia. There's a US military base and so forth. All of the other ones are totally uninhabited and basically pristine. And this is not the Indian Ocean territory. This is Mali, the capital of the Maldives. It is very interesting because going from Mali to Chagos is literally by definition, the polar opposites. You cannot get more extreme from this. Mali is literally a concrete jungle where there is nothing, not 1 square metre of natural vegetation or plants or animals, whereas Chagos is the opposite. The other islands except Diego Garcia, there is no trace really, there's nothing, there's no people, there's no real pollution, there's nothing. It is completely wild and natural. So you can see Mali. So we left that to go to the total opposite. This is what Chagos is like. It is the opposite, the last example of a major system of coral islands in the tropics, or atolls I should really say. It consists of 7 major atolls. And is honestly, I can honestly say, it's just simply the most beautiful place you can imagine. It's not like the Maldives, it's not like, imagine the Maldives or Seychelles with nothing, no development, no stupid tourists running around trying to take a photo. Nothing. It's paradise. But unfortunately, it's closed to tourism. Sorry. Anyway, to get there, we were given the great honour by the Foreign Office. They were so kind and supportive. I was actually refused to go to Chagos twice, or British Indian Ocean Territory twice, but very, very, very kindly, towards the end of the project, they gave permission to go, for which I'm always forever grateful, to enable the project to be complete. And no one has filmed and broadcast here, certainly since the 70s. I don't think actually ever. The BBC have never been, literally no one has been there to film for broadcast like this. So it was an incredible privilege and one that we did not take lightly. We respected enormously by the Foreign Office to allow us to go. But to get there, we had to go from the Maldives, from Mali in a dhoni, which is a Maldivian dhow, to the southernmost island in the Maldives archipelago, which is called Gan. And to there, we had to get a charter yacht to come from Cape Town in South Africa for 3 months across the Indian Ocean. This took 3 years to set up. And the idea was to meet the yacht in Gan, the southernmost island of the Maldives. And by an extreme, I totally wasn't almost believing that it would be there, but it was exactly where it was meant to be. And it was almost a bit like Dr. Livingstone's famous meeting in Antarctica, in Africa. You know, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Well, I was like that with Jeremy, the skipper. Jeremy, I presume. And we met the jerry can and put across our equipment and set sail to Chagos. And like I say, this really is pretty much one of the climaxes of the whole project, because it is unspeakably beautiful and unspeakably special, and it is so important that it's conserved and protected, because there is nowhere else like it. What it is, it's a glimpse of the world basically before we impacted it. It is a glimpse of the world without us. It's a glimpse of that time before we dominated wildlife across the planet. And it's one of the very few places where we have a benchmark to measure our impacts across the rest of the planet. It's also very special because the maps have unsurveyed on them. It's unsurveyed, much of it. And even islands that haven't been named yet. This island really has no name. Where else, really, where else on the entire planet can you find that? You can't. Even in Antarctica, every single island has been named, even rocks have been named. It is incredibly special. And this is on that unnamed island. I did geography at university, and as a geographer, I had to go ashore on an unnamed island. So I explored a little bit there. But the real reason why we went there, of course, is for the underwater life. It has the largest living coral atoll on Earth. The water clarity is the greatest on the planet. It is the least polluted waters on Earth. I'm not exaggerating, it really is the least polluted waters on the planet. They're less polluted than Antarctica. From all the places that have been tested on Earth, here is the least polluted. Chemically, you can see something like 65 meters underwater, and pretty much you could see that here on Chagos. It's like swimming in an aquarium. The fish are just insane numbers, up to 60 times more fish than, for example, Mauritius, where it's been hunted and dynamited and all sorts of things. It's just fish off the chart. and enormous reef systems. Here's a beautiful anemone, and massive table corals, and anemone fish, which are endemic and occur nowhere else in the world, and equally unique brain corals that occur nowhere else on the planet. I mean, I'd love to tell you 100 stories about the marine life, but we can't tonight. But equally, the life on land, on the little islands, there's about 60, and on those islands, it also is so special. Island ecosystems are very different from continental ecosystems. Generally, on distant ocean islands, mammals are absent. Mammals basically don't get to really distant islands. So as a consequence, there were never any rats, cats, dogs, canines, whatever. There were no mammals on these islands. On some islands you get bats, of course, but that's a little bit different. So as a consequence of there being no terrestrial mammals, generally arthropods, bugs, or crabs in this case, and birds generally rule supreme. So it's a very different ecosystem from on continents. And I wanted to see this animal since I was a kid. This is the rubber crab, or coconut crab, the biggest terrestrial arthropod or invertebrate alive today. This is actually as big as arthropods can get in the current atmosphere with the current oxygen levels on Earth. And they can have a leg span that is 90 centimeters. These things climb coconut trees, get coconuts, then rip the coconuts open to eat them. They're unbelievably powerful, but they're not dangerous. I mean, if you put your hands in the claws, they would definitely cut off your fingers, definitely. They're so powerful. But they're not aggressive. You can handle them really easily. You can pick them up very easily. And this one gives you an idea of the size. And they can literally be 90 centimeter leg spans, like that big. They're massive. And this was a dream. This was the shot, the sequence in the documentary. I hope to get more than any, and we totally got it, which was wonderful. Anyway, just to finish British and Ocean Territory, they also are special for having these intact hardwood forests. These are bird's nest ferns and incredible hardwood trees. They're home to massive populations of seabirds, such as this juvenile red-footed booby here. So they're very special. Anyway, I would love to tell you for hours about Chagos, but we can't. The next territory is Pitcairn, which is in the middle of the Pacific, on the other side of the world. And this is the Claymore 2, the only vessel to go there on a regular basis, or in fact the only vessel really to go there. And she calls in there just 4 times a year. Pitcairn is very unusual because, unlike most places, through time it's become more isolated. Most places have become less isolated through time. For Pitcairn, the reverse is the case. Basically because 50, 60, 70 years ago, loads of freight ships, tankers would call in to get water or get food or barter for fruit and vegetables, all sorts of things. But in the last 20, 30, 40 years, things have become containerized. They've become much tighter schedules for health and safety. They can't go ashore. You know, there's hubs that you go straight to the hub, and you know, it's much more centralized. And as a consequence, Pitcairn used to have up to 100 freight vessels visiting a year. Now this is the only one, the Claymore 2. Some yachties also call in, but more people fly into space than go to Pitcairn. No, really, more people really do fly into space than really, they really do. Than go to Pitcairn. I get the sense you don't believe me. They do. Anyway, I'm sure as you know, the Pitcairn is very famous for the Mutiny on the Bounty story. The story, in a nutshell, is this: a ship called the Bounty left Britain in, I think, the 1780s, headed to Tahiti to get breadfruit to take to the Caribbean as cheap food for the slaves, the plantation workers. It got to Tahiti, collected the breadfruits, but as it was leaving and on the way back to the Caribbean, the crew mutinied and put their Captain William Bligh, in a boat, never expecting him to survive, with his lower men, and cast him adrift. Captain Bligh did get back to England. He sailed in one of the greatest maritime journeys of all time to Timor, and then finally made his way back to Britain, and another ship was sent out, and actually Bligh did the voyage again later with a separate vessel and succeeded. But the mutineers had to escape justice, because if they'd been caught they'd be hanged. So they escaped, and where they went, this is the genius. The leader was Fletcher Christian, this brooding, very intelligent person. And he designed this idea to go to Pitcairn Island, because Pitcairn was incorrectly placed on the map. You can't find a place that's incorrectly charted except by accident. So it's the perfect place to hide away. So he went to Pitcairn Island, deliberately burnt the Bounty, basically because otherwise a massive ship off the island would be a clear indication for any passing ships that passed it, and finally settled this island. And this is it. This is Pitcairn Island. It's 2 square miles. We reached it and went ashore and met the descendants of the mutineers. All of the people, the native population on Pitcairn, are directly descended from the mutineers, from the mutiny on the Bounty. They're incredible, warm, wonderful people. There's only 47 of them on the island, or there were indeed when I went, and they're wonderful, wonderful people. And I regret I only had a short time on the island. They once a year burn. The Bounty story is integral to Pitcairn. It is part of the culture, part of the history. It's part of the soul of the island. And once a year they burn an effigy of the Bounty just in front of where the ship was really burnt. This is Bounty Bay, and it was burnt just out here. And I dived down to the wreck site of the Bounty and saw the ballast stones and the few remnants of the ship out there. But once a year they burn an effigy of the Bounty. There are cannons from the Bounty, the Bible from the Bounty, all sorts of different artifacts from the Bounty. The story of the mutineers is somewhat dark. They got to Pitcairn with a load of Polynesian women and Polynesian men that they took from Tahiti. Got to the island thinking they would make a paradise, but it didn't happen like that. The European men treated the Polynesians almost as slaves, as good old Europeans tend to do, and you know, in the history of colonization of the world. And anyway, they sectioned the island up for themselves, but left nothing for the Polynesian men. And they only had, like, all the European men had a wife each, but the Polynesian men didn't. They only had 1 or 2 between all of them, which of course obviously is going to breed resentment. So the Polynesian men hatched a plan to murder the European men, but they were ratted out by one of the Polynesian women. The European mutineers slaughtered all of the Polynesian men. Then, over a year or so, they used up all the resources of the island and then started turning on each other. And it's a dark, grisly story, which is a wonderful story in its own right. But they basically killed one another in a series of murders. Fletcher Christian was one of the first to die. He had retreated up to this cave, and he was one of the first ones to be killed. And there was only 2 surviving left, and one of them died from natural causes, apparently. And the other one, the last one, John Adams, inherited the island and like 30 women and loads of kids, and became a weird patriarch of the island. He became very religious, perhaps because of the deaths, and everyone had to call him father. He became very religious, and the town was named after him. And eventually it was discovered 20, 30 years later by 2 whaling ships. There's a wonderful, much more complex story I'd love to tell you one time, but in a nutshell, that's it. Pitcairn I adored. There's 47 people, like I say. They have some wonderful traditions, like they ring the bells across the island when they sight ships. And they have an amazing language. They actually have some of the words from the mutineers preserved through time in their language, which is Pitcairns. So really, really, really fascinating language and history. It's not actually pirate talk, like it's not Avars there and me hearties, but it really does have some incredible, and also accents, words that sound, at least to my ear, West Country, from whence many of the mutineers came. So it's a very interesting place in that respect. I don't mean this in any way disrespectfully. I just wanted to know the stories of the people there. I interviewed, there were 7 children. I interviewed one of the girls, and I wanted to know what it was like living on Pitcairn, and she told me this wonderful story. I said, well, can you imagine what it's like, what London is like? You spent your entire life in 2 square miles with up to 46 other people, because there's only 47 on the island. Can you imagine what London is like? And she said, well, there must be at least 100 people, or you must have to shout really loudly, because in the wonderful innocence of the mind of a child, she is on Pitcairn and shouts to find her friends. Yet, of course, in London, that's not how it works. We have mobile phones and so forth. But no, I don't mean this in any way derogatively. I really don't. I just mean it's so interesting looking inside her mind and just seeing what it is like in that respect. And to her, there are no horses on Pitcairn, and she'd seen, of course, photos of horses, and to her a horse was like a mythological animal, like a dragon would be to us, and she would draw pictures and pretend to be a horse, and it was so fascinating in that respect to see her mind in that respect. So really a wonderful, wonderful island with some incredible endemic plants and lots of introduced ones. This is an endemic boutilon. And even, like, this shows how far our impact is. We've even introduced giant tortoises to Pitcairn. This one is called Mrs. T, and she's the sole survivor. And there was even a chimpanzee at one time, if you can believe it, on Pitcairn. There really was. Anyway, sorry, moving towards, and I'll do the last territories quicker because, because I've already passed my tongue. There's 6 territories in the Caribbean. I'll do them all together because many of the stories are similar. Basically, as I'm sure we all know, the Caribbean, or the New World, was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492. In 1493, he returned with 17 ships, and with an endeavour to start the colonisation of the New World. One of the first places he reached was the British Virgin Islands, a territory today. However, Christopher Columbus did not actually discover the New World. It was already discovered very nicely, thank you very much, by the Amerindians, the native people of this place, particularly the Arawak and the Carib. And of course the Carib give their name to the Caribbean. If you explore the caves of many of these islands, you will find intricate pictograms and carvings in the rocks, which are testimony to their cultures. And of course it's an interesting point to make that introduced non-native species is not just symptomatic of European cultures. The Amerindians had their own introduced plants and animals. On their canoes from South America, they transported red-footed tortoises as a food. As we eat sheep or cows today, they ate the red-footed tortoises. And they are now present on most of the islands where the Amerindians settled, even though the Amerindians have sadly vanished through disease, colonization, slavery, and so forth. Their introduced species outlived them, and I'm quite certain that the species that we have introduced around the globe will outlive us as a species. Of course, there's slightly darker, well, also a darker chapter in Caribbean history are the plantations. Vast sugar mills and cotton mills that were constructed, and inside many of these you find on the walls the faint etchings of the dreams of slaves, which are, in this case, a tall sailing ship, which is of course what transported the slaves from Africa to their cruel fate on the Caribbean islands. The Caribbean islands, by the way, provided the majority of the wealth of the British Empire for most of the empire's history, and slavery, of course, was one of the reasons for that, but of course was a deplorable, despicable industry. But it was interesting seeing the dreams of these slaves, and of course they were dreaming to escape back to the land of their birth and escape back to where they came. And even the cotton plants still often grow amongst the ruins of these great plantation buildings as a testimony to the slavery that happened there. Anyway, the Caribbean has the oldest of all the British territories, Bermuda, which is the longest continually inhabited English settlement outside the British Isles. And I believe it's over 400 years old now. It has its own unique, proud culture and heritage. They used to build these incredible structures with limestone roofs to trap water for being such a valuable commodity on these low-lying islands. They were fiercely defended with castles and cannons and ramparts. But today, there's lots of ecological issues and problems. These guys, the lionfish, are the rats of the sea. These are from the Indo-Pacific and Red Sea, but no one really knows how they were introduced to the Caribbean, possibly by people just releasing their pets into the ocean, or by hurricanes flooding aquariums in Florida. No one really knows. But in any case, what we do know is now there are literally hundreds of millions of lionfish all across the Caribbean, and they're invulnerable to the predators like sharks because of their poisonous spines, and so they can just sit on the coral heads and gobble up all the baby fish of the native species. And in some areas they represent up to 95% of the local fish stocks. They just literally have wiped everything out. But the conservationists are fighting back, and they've developed these spear guns and go down and literally spear the lionfish. And we went down to film that with them. And it might sound cruel, but come on, we have to rebalance the ecosystem. We just have to, at least to give the native species, the unique species, a chance. And it's this wonderful strategy that shows that if you can align conservation and making money, that's the best way to succeed. Lionfish are shot with these spears. The meat is sold into supermarkets and restaurants, which pays the divers, and basically it's so-called eat 'em to beat 'em strategy, and it really, really works. And it's actually a delicious, really delicious meat. In a similar way, these queen conch, or conch, people pronounce it differently, shells, which are an endangered species, they occur all across the Caribbean and were hunted in. This is nothing. These things go on huge, huge distances. These are literally, I haven't got a really big photo, but just believe me, this is nothing. They are millions of shells strong, these drifts of them. And unfortunately, the conchs were hunted. This is a mature one with a flange, a flat bit at the front. And okay, you can take them out of the water, providing that they've had a chance to reproduce and there is at least a new generation. The problem is they took the baby ones, the little ones out, before they could even reproduce. And as a consequence, of course, the population plummeted. However, a really great strategy on Turks and Caicos is to create these conch farms, whereby they can breed conch and grow them up way, way, way easier and make more money by doing that than harvesting them from the wild, making more money and leaving the wild populations alone. So it's just if you can apply intelligent strategies to conservation issues, people can make more money and you can replenish and safeguard the native populations. One story along those lines of this is the blue iguana from Grand Cayman on the Cayman Islands. And this little fella is incredible because, well, actually, he's about that big. He's quite a big fella. And he starts the day off grey or almost blackish, but by lunchtime in the warmth of the day turns bright blue, and much bluer in fact than this photo depicts. And they're really incredible. But by 2002, there are only a couple of hundred left, and they are predicted to be extinct by 2007. But it just goes to show conservation is not just the domain of billion-dollar organizations or multi-government and government organizations. You don't need that. It can literally be just one person that cares enough and acts and stops the species going off the cliff of extinction. And such was the case here. The conservationists on Cayman just literally said, no, that is not good enough. We are not letting this incredible animal become extinct. We will not allow that to happen. So they rounded up those last few blue iguanas with no funding at all, built pens to breed them, such as these, and now there's thousands again, and they're reintroducing them back in the wild, and will one day close this breeding facility. So it just goes to show all you need is to care and act and do, and you really can change the fate of entire species, which is of course incredible. One of the last Caribbean stories I've got time for is Montserrat. As I'm sure many of you know, Montserrat is this verdant, beautiful emerald island, but in 1995 it exploded. And the hammer fell hardest precisely on the capital city, Plymouth, which was home to about 30,000 people. And the volcano exploded and made pyroclastic flows, ash flows, that just littered the island. 2/3 of it is, or more in fact, is still no-go areas, but we managed to be given permission to go in. And as you'll see, it's like a modern-day Pompeii. The ash covers up to roof level, and even there are like newspapers that are preserved in the acidic ash that blow around on the ground. It had ecological consequences. The ash is acidic, and the bats became bald. The acid burnt off all their fur, and also covered the fruit that they eat, so it ground down their teeth like sandpaper. So tragically, the poor old bats became bald and lost their teeth. But they have actually bounced back incredibly well. And the plants likewise were completely obliterated, but nature has a funny way. The ash also ironically was a fertilizer, and in the last 20 years the vegetation has exploded back, healthier and more luxuriant perhaps than it even was before. So I mean, that story shows that even in the darkest of circumstances nature can find a way. But there was one through this whole journey, there's been one thing that's been looming, and one darker force, one force that is more powerful, but it's also silent and unnoticeable. It's a creeping force that's sweeping across the globe, and a darker, much more powerful even than the volcano of Montserrat, and more deadly. On the caves of Bermuda, we saw these limestone, spectacular limestone stalactites and stalagmites. As I'm sure you know, they form in air from water dripping, and they can only form in air. It's impossible they form underwater. Inside the cave systems of Bermuda, vast arrays of stalactites and stalagmites are submerged underwater, which is completely categorical proof of rising sea level change. We also offshore, there are entire forests of cedar trees with coral growing around them. And this basically is from the last glacial maximum. The sea level rise has flooded these places. Now what this represents is a much darker, much more sinister force. And what you can argue whether mankind, we, are behind climate change, global warming, sea level rise or not. You can totally argue that. But what you definitely cannot argue is that it's happening. It is totally irrefutable scientific fact that the planet is warming, the ice is melting, the sea level is rising. That's not to say that it's caused by man or not. You can debate that. But you cannot debate that the sea levels are rising. And this is totally clear evidence of that. And of course, were that to continue and to happen on the worst predictions take place, within just a few meters, entire islands would be snuffed out. And this is very different from the volcano because, for example, if Bermuda is submerged, there is no coming back, there is no salvation, there is no recovery, there is no hope. It's just snuffed out. And those endemic species are just simply lost forever, like birds that breed only there and nowhere else in the world. Anyway, the very last two territories are in the Mediterranean. The bases on Cyprus, Akrotiri and Dhekelia, and Gibraltar. And this is the bases on Cyprus, the sovereign base areas, to basically their Royal Air Force bases. They're very special because they're important RAF bases. They basically, in the base areas, no one has ever been allowed to develop, or civilians can't go there. And as a consequence, they're the best nature reserves on the planet. They're home to spectacular populations of animals and plants that have been wiped out across, particularly the lowlands, across much of the rest of the Mediterranean, like beautiful populations of flamingos. And equally interesting, incredible archaeological remains, temples and amphitheatres, and because no one is allowed to go there, everything is totally intact. And all you have to do is walk along the ground, and within seconds you can find bundles of Roman pottery and different, even older potteries. It's just incredible. It is literally dripping with archaeology, which I love just as much as wildlife. The Cyprus bases have been extremely important strategically for the defence of freedom, such as the campaign to liberate Libya, and of course are very important for the Mediterranean. But the last one is Gibraltar, and this has played an even more important role in recent history. Few people appreciate or realise that Gibraltar was absolutely key in World War II. It was Moorish, then Spanish, then British for 1,300 years. And in it was played a key role in the Battle of Trafalgar, and that's where Nelson's fleet went from. But in World War II, it was totally pivotal. If Gibraltar had fallen, the entrance to the Mediterranean would have been shut. Really, it's very questionable whether an African campaign or a second front or the frontage in the Mediterranean could really have been launched. It's very questionable whether that would have been viable. In World War II, Winston Churchill built 35 miles of tunnels through the rocks, and even secret stay-behind tunnels that have only been found in the last couple of years. They were secret, hidden away behind passages and walls, and people have just discovered them and broken into them and found rooms lined with cork and special chalk that absorbs sound. And the idea was that 5 or 6 people would volunteer to stay in them if the rock had fallen, and they would spy on the Nazis if the rock had been taken, and they would feed a wire through a special hole and radio the movements of the Nazis. They're these extraordinary tunnels. The last thing on Gibraltar I want to tell you about is this really amazing Neanderthal history. As I'm sure you may know, Homo neanderthalensis is a different species of human. It's a predecessor of our species, Homo sapiens. And on Gibraltar, the very first non-Homo sapiens skull, a Homo neanderthal skull, was found, actually before the Neanderthal Valley in Germany. It was the very first skull. It was sent to England, and this is actually it. This is Gibraltar 1, the specimen. It was sent back to London and studied by Charles Darwin, who realised that it was a different species of man, a different species of human. Anyway, it's since been found that Gibraltar is the largest concentration of Neanderthal remains. It's also the place where all of the other Neanderthals in the range died out, and for thousands of years a stronghold survived on Gibraltar. So it's been Moorish, then Spanish, then British for 1,300 years, but it's been a Neanderthal stronghold for 100,000 years. It's just mind-boggling. And I mean, it's unlikely, but it's possible. At that time, during the last ice age, the water was much lower. There were savannas and plains in front of Gibraltar. And it's very possible that the last Neanderthal family lived in caves such as this. And maybe mum and dad went out hunting, leaving a child at home. Maybe they never came back. Maybe they were killed hunting an animal. And that one child was the last Neanderthal, the last of her kind, perhaps living out her days in isolation in this cave, and then finally died. And with that death, not just Gibraltar, but the whole planet transferred to our species, Homo sapiens. So the Gibraltar, the last thing is, of course, it's famous for the Barbary macaques. These iconic little animals, Europe's only population of wild monkeys. And they're very significant because there's a legend of the macaques, which is that if the macaques were to leave Gibraltar, the rock would fall and the British would leave. Winston Churchill believed in this legend so vehemently that during World War II, to bolster the troop morale, he shipped in monkeys, or macaques rather, from Africa to enable them. And the conclusion is basically this, that the territories today are not colonies. This is not a 19th century empire. On the contrary, they are wonderful self-governing entities that have their own destiny and their own future. Britain's role is not to dominate them, not empire, not to control them, but on the contrary, it's the opposite of that legend. It's to ensure and help the people of the territories to ensure this incredible treasure, this treasure that's worth more than gold and silver, this unique wildlife, these unique cultures, these landscapes and these amazing people of the territories, to ensure that all of that treasure survives long into the future. And that's basically the end of my talk. So just a couple of quick points I want to finish on. Just please remember the territories have 20 times the biodiversity of mainland Britain. They get less than 2% of the conservation funding. They have thousands of unique species. I have a special thanks for listening, and there's 3 special people in the audience I'd like to thank. My dear old mother, Rowan, who came with me to Tristan and Chagos, and also very, very, very specially Steve Nichols. I'm not sure where he is. Here he is in the middle, who I am forever grateful to for believing in the project. Steve is the producer for the series and really made it possible and made it more beautiful than I ever could imagine. So no matter where it goes or whichever channel it ends up, I'm forever grateful to all 3, of course, but Steve especially for doing that. So in a very last, I just want to end, if it's okay, on one last little thing, which is basically the project. I was never trying to do it just go there, make a lovely book and film and just go. That was never the plan. In the production budget we're giving like £1,300 or more than that actually to every single one of the territory. It's not going to change the world, but it's a gesture of goodwill. And the lesson from all this is that, you know, anyone can make a difference, and even though I know that money isn't going to change anything, really, it's every little counts, basically. We're discussing with broadcasters now. I'm going to give out a load of cards. If you want my contact details, you can email me and I'll tell you when the series is online, on TV. We're also, I'm doing a book, a natural history book alongside it, to try and raise money for all the territories and give back to all of them. I'm not trying to sell this to you. However, if you like the territories and if you like their wildlife, I've organised a Kickstarter campaign. The basic premise is to use the footage that's not in the broadcast series to make 16 short videos, one for each territory, only about 5 or 7 minutes long, to release online and give to all of the territories, all the conservation organisations who want nothing in return. They can have them for free, to give them out there as a free resource that everyone can enjoy and everyone can watch. So that's the goal. I've started a Kickstarter project, which is a crowdfunding website, which basically means, you know, anyone puts in from £1 to whatever they want to, and basically makes it possible to do them professionally, which is what I want. And to make 16 of them, I have to raise about 11 grand to employ the editors, the producer, the editors, the equipment to do it really well, which is what I want to do. And we've already got the footage, we've got everything. If there's any possibility that any of you are willing to support this, I'll give you a card with my details and this detail on as this next thing plays. So just for 2 minutes, I'm going to show you one of these little clips, which I'm not sure how to do. We've only got 24 days left on the Kickstarter campaign, and the idea is basically to make 16 of these little videos. I just want to say thank you so much for listening. It's been a real pleasure addressing and showing you hopefully the secret side of the UK. So thank you very, very, very much for listening. I think I'm sorry I've overshot a little bit, and I don't think we've got time for questions, but I'll be outside. If anyone does have questions, it'd be a pleasure. So thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good, thanks. Thanks. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Oh, and sorry. Last of all, like I could say, if you want to send me an email, I've got a list. I'll definitely keep you up to date and basically tell you everything that there is about the project. So you've got all the cards. If you want to be kept informed, just send us an email. So thank you very much and good evening. Cheers.
So thank you for coming tonight. Just to say, we'll put the details of the Kickstarter funding project on the website, so you can access it there. 2 weeks' time, another fantastic lecture. Hope to see you then. And please, could you vacate the premises fairly quickly, because we're under a free line to get you out here by 9:30. Thank you very much.
Sorry, that was my bad. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks.